What's up, y'all? It's Project Photography back with another video, and today we got an amazing video for you guys. We're doing our first impressions of the Tamron 70-300 for the Nikon Z mount. And as a landscape photographer, your telephoto lens is important, and this is the only 70-300 that's available in the Nikon Z mount. But today's episode is going to be just a little bit different from your ordinary first impressions, because other lenses and bodies that I've made first impressions and reviews on in the past have been all items that I have bought myself. But this lens right here, the 70-300 from Tamron, was loaned to me by Tamron. So this is going to be a little bit different because this isn't a lens that I am keeping myself. This is one that I'm going to be reviewing and sending back almost immediately. So in this episode, I just want you to keep in mind that even though this was sent to me, all of my opinions and takes on this lens are all completely unfiltered, and it's my professional review of this lens. But with that being said, I am very excited to do my first impressions of this lens. Like I said before, this is the only 70-300 that's available in the Nikon Z mount. The only other telephoto lens for landscape photographers really is a 24-200. That's a lens I already own, which is why I don't really need this lens for landscape photography. But nonetheless, we're here at the beautiful Chino Hills State Park. It is really green, and only this time of year is it actually green. So what we're gonna go ahead and do is do some POV shots with this lens. I'm going to be going around shooting some photos. It's getting a bit dark now, as you guys can see. But after that, we're going to go back to my studio. I'm going to look at the photos, edit them, and then give you my true first impressions of this lens. But a few things that I'm going to be looking out for in this lens is definitely how the handling is. I mean, this is definitely a much bigger lens than the 24-200. So I want to see, how does it handle? How does it feel in the hand when I'm having it on a tripod and just shooting with it in general? The next aspect I'm going to be looking at is definitely the image quality, as with any lens, but I'm going to be looking at it from a landscape photographer's perspective with the telephoto side of things in mind, because a lens like this is perfect for isolating and shooting mountains and certain subject matter that are far off in the distance. So this lens is going to be perfect for that, and perfect for this type of environment actually. So as we let the sun go down, we're going to give it a little bit, but once the sun is fully down, we're going to go ahead and shoot some landscape images with this lens. I'm excited to see what the images look like. So with that being said, let's jump right in and do some POV landscape photography. What's up, y'all? We're now behind the scenes, behind the camera, and we are going to be doing a little bit of POV photography with this lens, the Tamron 70-300. And you're going to notice that I'm not going to be using any mechanical shutter, and you're not going to hear any noises because I'm using all electronic shutter. I'll explain that more later. But this composition right here, I'm trying to get more of an overall landscape approach as the unedited, and here we go to the edited version. And my thought process when editing this was to make it a little bit of a hazy sort of feel, because we still have some strong lighting in the background, and I feel like the foreground elements was a bit difficult to edit for sure. And I just felt like a bit of a hazy look would definitely give it a much more unique feel. This is definitely deviated from my normal sort of editing style, but I think it's nice. I like the colors, actually very pastel feeling. Overall, I think it's a pretty decent photo, just shooting at 70mm, nothing crazy here. So now we're gonna be switching the camera into vertical orientation, and because I have an L bracket, it's gonna be a lot easier to go ahead and do that. But I'm gonna go ahead and zooming out to around 200mm, give or take. And I see these mountains in the background that I kind of want to create a sort of layered feel and effect to the image. And I think it'd be really interesting because I think the mountains are absolutely gorgeous and I want to showcase them in the best way possible. The lighting right now I think is the best it's going to get, mainly because I feel like the sun is pretty much at sunset. It's not at blue hour yet, but I think sunset. So I think we're going to get some really nice colors. We go ahead and capture the image. As you can see, it's very hazy feeling, right? And I want to kind of jump on that a little bit more, get a sort of hazy feel to the image, kind of similar to the previous one, because I just found it was a little bit difficult to try and crunch those shadows. So having that hazy sort of feel definitely created a really nice image in my opinion. And as you can see right here, I love the colors. I think they're nice and light, and it's kind of reflected as to how the images and the view looked that day. So let's go ahead and keep moving on here. So the next image we're actually going to take is of the sunset right here. So that's actually where the sun is setting in particular. And what we're going to want to do is actually create a panorama. So what we're going to do is shoot a bunch of vertical images and then stack them together, or more like stitch them together in post-production to get a panorama photo. What this can do is actually increase our megapixel count by quite a bit. I think this image right here is going to be around 80. So as you can see, we're panning, we're shooting a bunch of images, and then at the end of it, we're able to get our 87 megapixel file from a 24 megapixel sensor. And I love to do this a lot because you just get really interesting compositions because they're not your normal aspect ratio, right? We're a lot wider, and I just feel like you're able to increase your megapixel count. You just get a bunch of benefits with shooting a panorama. So this is a method that I like to use quite a bit when I'm doing landscape photography, especially with a telephoto lens, and we were able to capture it. So let's go ahead and move on here. And I'm still going to keep my camera in vertical orientation, but I'm definitely going to be focusing on a different aspect of the landscape, right? We're of course shooting a ton of mountains, and we want to definitely capitalize on that, but we're going to have a different perspective, a different view, and that's exactly what we're going to try and do here. So we can go ahead and capture the image right now. This is the unedited version, and we're definitely going a lot wider with this. We're not zooming in all the way at 300 millimeters. We're definitely shooting at around 70. And as you can see right here, we have the same sort of feel to the image, right? We're having that sort of hazy feel, but I feel like I kind of overexposed this a little bit in post-production, so it's something I can definitely go back and look at later. But yeah, guys, that's pretty much it for the images I took. I felt like there wasn't much because the sun was going down so fast. These are the images that I shot from today. Let me know what you thought was your favorite one down in the comment section down below. I think these are pretty decent. I feel like they could have been better, but there's only so much you can do with the light, and I was definitely rushing to get over there to shoot the photos. So anyways, guys, with that being said, let's get right back to the video. All right, y'all, so I just did my shoot and finished all the photos that I wanted to get. As you can see, it is getting pretty dark out here, so what we're going to go ahead and do is go right back to my office. I'm going to go ahead and edit the photos and look at them, and then give you guys my first impressions of the Tamron 70-300 for the Nikon Z mount. All right, y'all, so now that we did all the editing, I went through all the photos, looked at them. Now it is time to do my full first impressions of this lens, the Tamron 70-300. Now, first of all, I think this is a really unique lens to take a look at for this system for a few reasons. First of all, this is the only 70-300 for the Nikon Z mount. I think I mentioned that earlier, but this is really unique because we don't have a lens like this. This is a lens that Nikon hasn't come out with, but it's a lens that I know that a lot of photographers have been looking out for some time. So testing this lens is actually really crucial for this Nikon Z system to see if photographers should pick up a lens like this for landscape photography. So before we dive right into the first impressions, I'm going to be talking about mainly the ergonomics and the optics of this lens. So jumping right into ergonomics, first of all, this lens has definitely a very plastic build. And it's not bad. I mean, it is what it is. Of course, you would love to see some more metal, but we understand that this is more of a budget lens. But with that being said, it does feel all right. I wouldn't say it's like super plasticky like the 50-250 from the Nikon Z mount, but it's also not as well constructed as something like the 24-200. It sits somewhere in the middle between those two. But even though it does have a plastic body, it does have a nice metal mount, which I personally like. I think metal mounts are definitely more beneficial for photographers. It just makes the lens, putting the lens on the camera, a lot more enjoyable of an experience. And overall, it's nice that it has a metal mount. So one thing that did bother me while I was shooting is the fact that the zoom ring as well as the focus ring aren't the smoothest rings that I've used. And now this might not be an issue for some of y'all, but for me personally, I do enjoy when my zoom and focus ring are smooth because it allows me to be a little more pinpoint when I'm actually shooting and focusing and zooming. And when it's not as smooth, it makes it just a little bit harder to get the pinpoint accurate focus and the exact focal length that you want to shoot at. For some people, that might not be a problem, but for me, it's definitely something that I notice, especially since I manual focus all the time. And speaking of manual focus, this lens does not have an AF/MF switch. Now, for me, this is something that I wish was in pretty much every lens, and I feel like should be standard practice for pretty much all lenses, but it's just not in here, and it makes it a little bit of a hassle when I'm going between video and then shooting landscapes. Always prefer to have an AF/MF switch. So something about this lens that I kind of took note of when I was unboxing is the fact that it is really long. It's definitely a longer lens than your normal lens, and this is definitely longer than my 24-200. And when you zoom it out even more, it does just get that much longer. And of course, this is paramount to any lens that is in existence. When you zoom it out, of course, you're gonna get a longer lens, but it definitely is a little bit more detrimental when you're using it on a tripod. And for me, it was definitely a little bit more difficult to balance this lens on a tripod when it's zoomed out. but that's just something you have to kind of adjust to. It just makes it a little bit hard to get that composition. You have to be a little bit more patient when you're grabbing the shot. And speaking of its size, this does take up quite a bit of space in my bag. It's longer than my normal telephoto lens, and it just makes it that much more difficult to move it around and carry it. But overall, it is very lightweight, I have to say. It is a joy to actually hold, mainly because it is so lightweight. I don't feel like it takes up that much weight in my bag. But the other gripe I really have is that the fact there's no locking switch, and pretty much all the Nikon Z lenses that zoom out pretty far, like the 24-200, has a locking ring, which makes it really nice to carry in my bag because I don't have to worry about it moving around. When it's locked, it's staying there and it's steady. But this one doesn't have it, so that's just something to note. So now let's talk about optics, and for me, this is an area that I definitely need to test a lot more, because there are some reservations that I have. And the most glaring problem with this lens to me is the fact that it doesn't have any sort of image stabilization. Now, you wouldn't think that this isn't a problem for landscape photographers. When I'm shooting with a telephoto lens and I'm going to like 1/5 of a second and we're putting it on a tripod, having a lack of VR or image stabilization is actually a problem when using a mechanical shutter. Now, let me explain why. With vibration reduction or image stabilization, when you're shooting and the mechanical shutter slaps, there is still image stabilization going on, so you're not going to feel the shock when it comes to the motion blur nearly as much. But with this lens, because there is no sort of image stabilization, you do definitely see the shutter shock, which affects how the image comes out. I noticed when I was shooting, I would take the image at like 1/5 of a second, and I normally do this with my telephoto lens. Like, it has not been a problem before. But with this lens, I would shoot an image and then using the mechanical shutter, and I would see the photo move. I would see the back LCD move, and I'm like, okay, this is a bit of an issue. And then I would zoom into my photos, and there was definitely motion blur. It was definitely prominent. You can see here on the screen, I have an image that I use the electronic shutter, I have an image that I use a mechanical shutter, and zoomed in, you can definitely tell the difference, and it is very prevalent. This is a problem for landscape photographers because we are shooting pretty much primarily in mechanical shutter, almost exclusively mechanical shutter. The only times I've ever really used electronic shutter is, to be honest, just with this lens, because I wouldn't be able to use mechanical shutter with it. And there's a few problems with this lens that culminates to this greater issue. The other issue is that the aperture is so closed down at its widest. It's a 4.5-6.3, which makes it even more difficult to get more light into this lens and to the sensor. Which means that if we're gonna get sharp images, we have to bump up the ISO or we have to use mechanical shutter, which is both going to result in a loss of dynamic range, and that's a problem as a landscape photographer. We're always trying to push out as much dynamic range as possible because when it comes to post-production, we definitely have one of the most intensive post-production processes out of all the niches of photography, and this lens just doesn't help that cause. Now, in the long run, you might have to end up using an electronic shutter with this lens, and that just might be how it is. And this is something I definitely need to test a lot more moving forward. I really don't know if I can say I'm definitive about this issue. Is definitely something that needs to be looked at more in the future with more testing and more images. But with that being said, how do the photos actually look when you do get them sharp? First of all, I think the images look kind of flat, to be honest. I just feel like there wasn't enough room for me to push it in Lightroom, and this might be because I'm using the electronic shutter, which does decrease the dynamic range. But I just felt like the images look kind of flat, lack of color, lack of contrast. But with that being said, I do think the images are very sharp. And as you can see here, if you look corner to corner, even though these mountains and this landscape is very far away, I'm able to get sharp images. And that is something that's really important. You can always work on color, you can always work on contrast, but having really sharp images is definitely important, especially when it comes to the Nikon Z mount. But also, there is distortion at the edges when you're shooting wide open. And honestly, majority of the time when you're shooting with this lens, you are gonna be shooting wide open because the aperture just isn't that bright. And I feel like this is kind of an issue with a lot of lenses nowadays, especially. I don't understand why, but we have so many 6.3 lenses at the long end, and I don't get it, to be honest. I feel like we need brighter lenses. 5.6 was a perfect number for lenses that weren't as expensive, more available to consumers. But this, of course, is just a first impressions. I have not been able to use this lens all that much. That shoot that you just saw is my first shoot with this lens. So there's gonna be a lot more testing, a lot more images that need to be taken for me to really come to a conclusive final thought about this lens. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. I really wanna like this lens, to be honest. there's just so many things that I felt like could have been better with this lens. It's just, we gotta look at it more, we gotta test it, but we'll see what the results are. But anyways guys, thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today. And if you enjoyed the video, please feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.